The morning air bit with autumn's chill as Donald Trump stepped out of the tall glass building in downtown Washington, D.C. He had just finished a meeting about a new business project, something he still kept up with even after his time in the White House. His black suit was sharp as always, and his security team moved around him like a practice dance. It was supposed to be a normal day. Get in the car. Drive to the next meeting. Repeat. The kind of day Trump had lived through thousands of times before. That's when he saw her. She sat alone on a bench across the street, her back straight despite the heavy backpack leaning against her legs. Most people rushed by without noticing her, eyes glued to phones or hurrying to somewhere important. In a city where power and money flowed like rivers, she was like a rock sitting still in the current, ignored by the rushing water around her. "Sir, the car is ready," said one of Trump's security guards, gesturing toward the black SUV waiting at the curb. Trump nodded but didn't move. Something about the woman caught his eye. Maybe it was the careful way she had folded her jacket beside her, or perhaps the military stiffness in her shoulders even as she stared down at her worn-out boots. An American flag patch, faded but clean, was carefully sewn onto her backpack, the stitching tight and precise. "Just a minute," Trump said, surprising his security team as he suddenly changed direction and headed toward the bench. The guards scrambled to adjust, forming a protective circle as they moved. Pedestrians began to notice, the usual whispers and pointing that followed Trump wherever he went. Some pulled out phones, recording the unexpected scene. The woman didn't look up as shadows fell across her. She'd learned in her months on the street that becoming invisible was sometimes the safest choice. Her hands, rough and calloused, gripped a small notebook where she had been writing something. "Excuse me," Trump said. When she finally looked up, her eyes showed no starstruck recognition, no excitement or fear, just the tired gaze of someone who had seen too much of life to be easily impressed. Her face was weathered, not from age, but from hardship, with a small scar cutting through her right eyebrow. Her hair was pulled back tightly, practical rather than stylish. "Do you mind if I sit down?" Trump asked, gesturing to the empty space beside her. The woman shrugged and moved her jacket to make room, eyeing the security team with more suspicion than she showed toward the former president. "I'm Donald Trump," he said, offering his hand. "I know who you are," she replied, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who hadn't spoken much lately. She hesitated before briefly shaking his hand. "I'm Linda, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army." Trump's expression changed, the businessman's smile shifting to something more thoughtful. "Thank you for your service." Linda nodded, having heard those words countless times before, words that paid no bills and secured no housing. "Afghanistan or Iraq?" Trump asked, settling onto the bench despite his aide whispering that they were running late for their next appointment. "Both," Linda answered. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Got back stateside for good about 2 years ago. A young man walking by nearly tripped when he recognized Trump sitting on a public bench. He fumbled for his phone, capturing what would soon become a viral image. The former president sitting beside a homeless veteran, both of them looking straight ahead as if their conversation was the most normal thing in the world. "And now you're here," Trump said, not as a question but as an observation. Linda's laugh held no humor. "And now I'm here." Funny how that works, isn't it? From driving armored vehicles through Kandahar to not being able to pay rent in the country I served. Trump studied her face, noticing the pride that still lived behind the exhaustion. This wasn't someone looking for pity, he realized. This was a soldier reporting facts as she saw them. "Would you mind telling me how that happened?" he asked, suddenly unaware of the growing crowd of onlookers or his security team's nervous glances. Linda looked at him for a long moment, measuring him with the careful assessment of someone who had learned the hard way that most people asking questions didn't really want honest answers. "You sure you want to hear that story, Mr. President? It's not a pretty one." Trump checked his watch, then surprised everyone when he leaned back on the bench. "I've got time," he said. Linda shifted on the bench, her military training still evident in how she squared her shoulders before speaking. The security team had formed a wider perimeter now, keeping curious onlookers at a distance, while Trump waited for her to begin. "I enlisted right after high school," Linda said, her eyes focused on something distant. "Small town in Ohio with not much going for it." The army offered a way out and a purpose. Turns out I was good at it. Trump nodded, watching how her hands moved as she spoke, calloused fingers tracing invisible patterns on her worn jeans. Worked my way up to staff sergeant, vehicle maintenance, then convoy security. My last tour, we hit an IED outside Kabul. She pointed to her lower back. Took some shrapnel. Doctors put me back together, but things were never quite right after. A cool breeze swept through the park, rustling the golden leaves overhead. Trump's aide coughed discreetly, tapping his watch. Trump waved him off. The physical stuff I could handle, Linda continued, her voice growing quieter so Trump had to lean in slightly. It's the other stuff that sneaks up on you. The nightmares. The way a car backfiring makes you hit the ground. How crowded rooms suddenly feel like traps. She pulled out a small bottle of pills from her jacket pocket, rattling them with a bitter smile. VA prescribed these for the pain, but they don't touch what really hurts. Trump's expression remained focused, his usual rapid-fire speech pattern replaced by attentive silence. A woman walking by recognized him and gasped, pulling out her phone to record the unusual scene. When I got out, I had some savings. Got an apartment, started working as a mechanic at a local garage. Linda's face brightened briefly at the memory. Was good at that too. But then the back went out completely. 3 surgeries later, I couldn't stand long enough to work. Boss was patient, but businesses need workers who can work. She gestured to her backpack. Started missing rent payments. Then came the eviction notice. My paperwork got lost somewhere in the VA system. Disability claim denied, then appeal. Appeal pending. Always pending. A police officer had noticed the growing crowd and approached Trump's security team. After a brief conversation, he backed away, clearly surprised to find a former president sitting on a park bench talking to a homeless veteran. Been on the street about 8 months now, Linda said matter-of-factly. Some nights at the shelter when there's room. Some nights. She glanced up at the sky. Well, I've slept under worse conditions. Trump frowned. You served what, 10 years? And this is how it ends. Linda's laugh held a harsh edge. This isn't the end, Mr. President, just a rough chapter. I still check my email at the library every day. Still call the VA every Monday morning. Still put in job applications anywhere that might look past the address field being empty. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded paper carefully protected in a plastic sleeve. It was a commendation signed by a commanding officer praising her exceptional service during a particularly difficult mission. Kept this. On the bad days, it reminds me I was somebody once. Somebody who mattered. Trump took the paper carefully, reading the words with unexpected reverence before handing it back. You're still somebody who matters, he said quietly. For the first time, Linda looked directly at him, searching his face for the practiced insincerity she'd come to expect from people in power. Something in his expression made her straighten even further. With all due respect, sir, I've heard nice words before. Congress people visit the shelters at Christmas. Candidates show up before elections. Everyone's sorry. Everyone's shocked. Nothing changes. Trump was silent for a long moment, the bustling city continuing around them. His security detail exchanged nervous glances. This unscheduled stop had already lasted far longer than they'd anticipated. Finally, Trump reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Words don't fix problems, he said, his tone shifting to something more familiar to those who had watched him in boardrooms. Actions fix problems. You've been failed by a system I helped run. That's unacceptable. Linda's expression remained guarded. She'd learned the hard way that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. What exactly are you planning to do? She asked. Trump stood up, motioning for one of his aides to come closer. Something I should have done a long time ago. The crowd around them had grown larger now, people stopping with curious expressions, phones held high to capture the unusual scene. Trump's security detail looked increasingly uncomfortable as their protective circle widened to accommodate the onlookers. Sir, one of the agents leaned in, we really need to get moving for your next appointment. Trump nodded but didn't rise from the bench. Instead, he turned to his aide who had hurried over. Cancel my next 2 meetings, he said firmly. The aide blinked in surprise. Sir, you have the investors from Singapore. They can wait, Trump interrupted. This can't. Linda watched this exchange with a mixture of confusion and wariness. In her experience, powerful people didn't change their schedules for people like her. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I wasn't asking for help." Trump turned back to her. "I know you weren't. That's exactly the problem. The people who deserve help the most are often the last ones to ask for it." He pulled out his phone again and made a quick call. "Mike, it's Donald. I need you to contact the VA secretary directly. Yes, right now." His voice had shifted to the commanding tone familiar from his days in office. "Tell him I need information on a disability claim for Staff Sergeant Linda from Ohio. Back injury, multiple surgeries, claim pending. I want to know exactly where her paperwork is and why it's taking so long." Linda's eyes widened slightly. "They won't tell you anything. Privacy laws." Trump covered the phone briefly. "Let me worry about that." Then, back to the call. "And Mike, get someone from the foundation on this too. I want options on my desk by tonight." As he hung up, a middle-aged woman pushed through the gathering crowd. She wore a press badge from a local news station and held out her phone like a microphone. "Mr. President, is this a planned event? Are you making a statement about veteran homelessness?" Before Trump could answer, another voice called out from the crowd. "That's my brother's old unit patch." A man in his 30s pointed to the insignia on Linda's backpack. "Were you with the 10th Mountain?" Linda nodded, surprised. "2 tours." The man stepped forward, holding out his hand. "My brother was there too, Staff Sergeant Patterson." A flicker of recognition crossed Linda's face. Rob Patterson. Tall guy, terrible at poker, but could fix anything with an engine. The man's face lit up. "That's him. He's back home in Pennsylvania now." More people pressed forward, the energy of the crowd shifting from curious onlookers to engaged participants. A woman handed Linda a coffee she'd just purchased from a nearby cart. Someone else offered a business card mentioning a brother-in-law who hired veterans. Trump watched as the impromptu gathering transformed around them. His security team had given up on moving him along and instead focused on maintaining a safe perimeter around the growing assembly. "This is what America should be," Trump said, gesturing to the people gathering around Linda. "Not walking past, but stopping to help." A teenage boy pushed forward through the crowd. "Mr. President, my dad was in Iraq too. He's not doing so good. Nobody helps him either." Trump's expression softened as he looked at the boy. "What's your dad's name, son?" William Taylor." Trump motioned for his aide again. "Add William Taylor to the list," he said quietly. Then louder to the boy, "We're going to look into your dad's situation too." Linda observed this exchange with a new intensity in her gaze. "You're serious about this," she said, not quite a question. "Dead serious," Trump replied. "The system is broken. I've known it for years. Talked about fixing it, but," he gestured vaguely, "politics gets in the way, red tape, bureaucracy." A news van had pulled up to the curb, and a camera crew was setting up. The local story was quickly becoming something bigger. "What are you planning to do?" Linda asked, eyeing the growing media presence with obvious discomfort. Trump stood up, straightening his tie. His voice carried, intentionally loud enough for others to hear. "I'm going to do what should have been done a long time ago. Create a direct line for veterans in crisis. No more waiting months for appointments. No more lost paperwork. No more excuses." The crowd had grown to several dozen people now, many recording with their phones. Trump turned to address them directly, slipping easily into the role of speaker. "This woman served our country honorably. She put her life on the line. And when she came home injured, the system failed her. How many more like her are out there forgotten?" People in the crowd began to call out names: brothers, sisters, parents, friends who had served and struggled after returning home. Linda stood up slowly, uncomfortable with the attention but seemingly moved by the stories being shared. "There are thousands," she said, her voice carrying despite its quietness. "And most of them won't be lucky enough to have a former president sit next to them on a bench." Trump turned back to her, the cameras capturing every word. "Maybe not. But after today, they'll have something else. My promise that this changes now." The crowd erupted in applause as Trump placed a hand on Linda's shoulder, both of them surrounded by a sea of phones, capturing the moment that would soon spread across the nation. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees as Trump's security team finally managed to create a path through the crowd. News vans from 3 different stations had arrived, reporters shouting questions as Trump guided Linda toward his waiting car. "Mr. President, is this a publicity stunt?" called one reporter, thrusting a microphone forward. Trump stopped, turning to face the cameras. Linda tried to step back, but he gently kept her at his side. "You think helping our veterans is a stunt?" Trump asked, his voice sharp. "That's what's wrong with this country. We've turned real problems into political talking points." The reporter blinked, caught off guard by the direct response. "Sir," a security agent urged, "we really need to move." Trump nodded and turned to Linda. "Come with me," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Unless you'd rather stay here." Linda glanced around at the crowd, the cameras, the sudden attention after months of being invisible. For a moment, she seemed ready to retreat, to disappear back into the anonymity of the streets. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice low. Trump didn't offer a smile or a practiced line. Instead, he simply said, "You shouldn't." "Not yet. But I'm asking for a chance to earn that trust." Something in his tone made Linda straighten her shoulders. She nodded once, military crisp, and followed him to the black SUV waiting at the curb. As the car pulled away from the curb, Linda sat stiffly, her backpack clutched on her lap like a shield. Trump made another call, his voice filling the otherwise silent vehicle. "Richard, it's Donald. I need a suite prepared at the hotel. Yes, right now." He glanced at Linda. "And have some clothes sent up. Size?" He raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Medium," Linda said quietly. "Medium," Trump repeated into the phone. "And get Dr. Wilson to come by. Back specialist, remember him?" "Good. 1 hour." As he hung up, Linda studied him with the careful assessment of someone used to looking for traps. "I don't eat charity," she said firmly. "It's not charity," Trump replied. "It's an investment." The car turned onto a wide avenue, pulling up to the gleaming entrance of the Trump International Hotel. Doormen in crisp uniforms rushed forward as the vehicle stopped. Linda stared up at the towering building, then down at her worn clothes. "I can't go in there." "It's my hotel," Trump said simply. "You can go wherever I say you can go." The lobby fell silent as they entered, Linda's battered boots squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor. The manager hurried forward, his practiced smile faltering slightly at the sight of Linda's weathered appearance beside the former president. "Mr. Trump, we've prepared the ambassador suite as requested." Trump nodded. "And Dr. Wilson?" "On his way, sir." Trump guided Linda toward the elevator, past staring guests and whispering staff. Inside the gleaming elevator car, Linda finally spoke again. "This morning I was invisible," she said quietly. "People walked past like I wasn't even there. Now I'm going to some fancy suite. Tomorrow, what happens? Back to the streets with a good story nobody will believe." The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway with plush carpeting. Trump stepped out, then turned to face her. "That depends on what you want to happen next." The suite was larger than any apartment Linda had ever lived in. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city where, just hours ago, she had been sitting on a bench with nowhere to go. A hotel employee brought in a rack of new clothes, while another wheeled in a cart of food. Linda stood frozen in the center of the room, looking out of place among the luxury. "I'll leave you to get settled," Trump said, checking his watch. "Dr. Wilson will be here in 30 minutes to look at your back. My assistant will bring some paperwork about your VA claim." Linda turned slowly, taking in the surroundings. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really?" Trump paused at the door. For a moment, the camera-ready persona slipped, revealing something more thoughtful. "When I was president, I signed bills about veteran care, made speeches, cut ribbons at VA facilities." He gestured vaguely. "Politics. But seeing you today, that's reality. That's what happens when the cameras turn off and the speeches end." He pulled out his phone, showing her a photo that was already trending online, the two of them sitting on the bench, her worn backpack beside his polished shoes. "This picture will be everywhere by tonight," he said. And for once, maybe people will stop arguing about left versus right long enough to remember what actually matters. Before Linda could respond, Trump's phone rang. He checked the number and his expression changed. "I need to take this," he said. "It's the VA secretary. I think he's about to explain exactly what happened to your paperwork." As Trump stepped out into the hallway to take the call, Linda walked slowly to the bathroom door. She caught sight of herself in the mirror. Dirty clothes, unwashed hair, the weariness etched into her face from months on the street. Behind her reflection, she could see the luxurious hotel room, the fresh clothes waiting, the food steaming on the cart. For the first time since they'd met, Linda allowed herself a small smile. "Well," she whispered to her reflection, "didn't see this coming." Linda stepped out of the shower feeling like a different person. The hot water had washed away days of grime, and the hotel's thick towels felt impossibly soft against her skin. She ran her fingers through her clean hair, still damp but no longer matted with dirt and sweat. The clothes laid out for her fit surprisingly well: simple dark jeans, a navy button-up shirt, and a soft gray sweater. Nothing flashy or expensive looking, just clean, decent clothes that wouldn't make her stand out. Someone had been thoughtful enough to include practical items too: sturdy socks, comfortable underwear, even a plain jacket. A knock at the door made her stiffen, old habits kicking in. "Who is it?" she called, voice automatically shifting to the firm tone she'd used as a sergeant. "Dr. Wilson," came the reply. "Mr. Trump asked me to check on your back injury." Linda opened the door to find a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a medical bag. He didn't seem surprised or judgmental about her situation, just nodded professionally and asked if she'd be comfortable talking about her medical history. For the next 40 minutes, Dr. Wilson listened carefully as Linda described the IED blast, the surgeries, the pain that never quite went away. He examined her back, noting the surgical scars and asking her to perform simple movements that made her wince. "The good news," he said when they finished, "is that there are treatments that could significantly improve your condition. The bad news is that you should have received them years ago." Linda gave a short, humorless laugh. "Try telling that to the VA." "Actually," Dr. Wilson said, closing his medical bag, "that's exactly what I intend to do. With your permission, I'd like to write up a detailed assessment and send it directly to your case manager." Before Linda could respond, there was another knock. This time, it was Trump's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman with a tablet and a folder of documents. "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs is on his way," she announced. "Mr. Trump asked me to help you prepare." Linda blinked. "The Secretary is coming here? Now?" The assistant nodded briskly. Mr. Trump was persuasive. She didn't elaborate, but the slight smile suggested the conversation had been memorable. "We'd have about 30 minutes to review your case file." Dr. Wilson excused himself, promising to send his report by morning. The assistant took his place at the suite's dining table, spreading out documents. "I pulled your complete file," she explained, showing Linda a thick stack of papers. "There's good news and bad news. The bad news is your claim was flagged for additional review because of a discrepancy between field medical reports and your stateside evaluation." Linda leaned forward, suddenly alert. "What discrepancy?" "I told them everything." The assistant pointed to 2 different documents. "According to this, your field medic reported potential spinal trauma immediately after the IED incident. But your intake evaluation at Walter Reed only mentions shrapnel wounds. Somehow, the back injury never made it into your primary medical record." "That's why they kept denying my claim," Linda said slowly, the pieces finally fitting together. "They thought I was making it up." "Exactly. But here's the good news: we found the original field report. Mr. Trump already had it sent to the Secretary, along with Dr. Wilson's preliminary assessment. They can't deny the evidence anymore." Linda sank back in her chair, a mix of emotions crossing her face: relief, vindication, and a flash of anger at the years lost to bureaucratic error. The suite's phone rang, and the assistant answered it. "Yes, sir, I'll let her know." She hung up and turned to Linda. "Mr. Trump and the Secretary are on their way up." Linda stood, automatically straightening her clothes and standing taller, the military bearing returning to her posture. The transformation from the disheveled woman on the bench was remarkable, though the wariness in her eyes remained. Minutes later, Trump entered with an older man in a dark suit who Linda recognized from news coverage as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The secretary seemed distinctly uncomfortable, his forced smile not reaching his eyes. "Ms. Linda," he said, extending his hand, "I want to personally apologize for the situation with your disability claim." Linda shook his hand firmly, her gaze steady. "With all due respect, sir, I don't need apologies. I need my back fixed and a roof over my head." The secretary glanced at Trump, who was watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "Yes, well," the secretary continued, "I've reviewed your case personally. There was indeed an error in how your medical records were processed. I signed an order expediting your claim. You should receive full back pay for disability benefits within the week." Linda's expression didn't change, years of disappointment having taught her to be skeptical of promises. "I've heard similar things before." Trump stepped forward. "The difference is, this time the secretary knows I'll be personally checking on your case in exactly 7 days." He turned to the official. "Isn't that right?" The secretary nodded quickly. "Absolutely. In fact, I've assigned my deputy to oversee this case personally." "And the other veterans I mentioned?" Trump asked. "We're gathering their files now. A special team will review each case." Linda watched this exchange with growing realization. Something bigger than her individual case was happening here. Trump wasn't just helping one homeless veteran, he was using her story to force action on a larger scale. As if reading her thoughts, Trump turned to her. "This isn't just about you anymore, Linda. Hope you don't mind, but you've become something of a symbol." He showed her his phone, where the photo of them on the bench had already been shared millions of times on social media. Hashtags were trending. Hashtag Remember Our Veterans. Hashtag No Veteran Forgotten. Hashtag Trump and Linda. The reality of what was happening finally hit her. After years of being invisible, Linda had suddenly become the most visible veteran in America. The next morning, Linda woke up disoriented. For a split second, panic gripped her as she didn't recognize her surroundings. Then reality rushed back, the hotel suite, Trump, everything that had happened yesterday. She sat up slowly, half expecting to find herself back on a shelter cot, the whole experience nothing but a dream. But the soft bed beneath her was real. Sunlight streamed through partially opened curtains, illuminating a room larger than any apartment she had since leaving the military. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Room service," called a voice. Linda opened the door to find a young man with a cart of food. He smiled politely, wheeling it into the room without a trace of the curious stares she'd received yesterday. "Mr. Trump asked me to tell you that he'll be here at 10 o'clock with some people he'd like you to meet," the server said. "Enjoy your breakfast, ma'am." Alone again, Linda lifted the silver covers to find eggs, bacon, toast, fruit, enough food for 3 people. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, painfully aware of how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. At precisely 10 o'clock, another knock came. Trump entered with 3 people, a professional-looking woman in a tailored suit, a man carrying a laptop, and an older gentleman with a kind face and gray hair. "Linda," Trump said, "these are the people I mentioned. This is Nancy, my foundation director." The woman stepped forward with a warm smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Linda. Mr. Trump has told me about your situation." "This is David," Trump continued, gesturing to the man with the laptop. "He handles public relations for the Trump Organization." David nodded politely but seemed more interested in setting up his computer on the dining table. "And this," Trump said, his voice softening slightly, "is Joe. He runs a veterans housing program in Maryland." The older man stepped forward, extending his hand. Unlike the others, his grip was colorless, his simple watch and modest clothes standing in contrast to the luxury around them. 20 years in the Army before I started the program, Joe explained. "We provide housing and job training for vets transitioning back to civilian life." Linda shook his hand, recognizing something familiar in his eyes. The same look many veterans shared, a mixture of seen too much and not backing down. "Please sit." Trump gestured to the suite's sitting area. "We have a lot to talk about." For the next hour, they outlined a plan that made Linda's head spin. Trump had spent the night making calls, pulling in favors, and making what Nancy diplomatically called passionate requests to wealthy friends and business associates. We're announcing a new initiative, Trump explained as David turned his laptop to show a mock-up of a website. The Veterans Second Chance Foundation, starting with a personal donation of $5 million. Linda's eyes widened. $5 million? Trump nodded. Just to get it started. We've already secured commitments for another $15 million from donors who, let's say, they found it difficult to say no. Nancy jumped in with details. The foundation would focus on 3 areas: emergency housing for homeless veterans, expedited medical care outside the VA system, and legal assistance for those struggling with benefit claims. And we want you to be part of it, Joe said to Linda. Your story is powerful. It puts a face to a problem most Americans prefer to ignore. Linda frowned. You want to use me as a poster child? No, Trump said firmly. We want to offer you a job. The room fell silent as Linda processed this. What kind of job? She asked cautiously. Director of Veteran Outreach, Nancy replied. You know what these men and women are going through because you've lived it. You speak their language. You can reach them in ways we can't. Linda looked down at her hands, clean now, but she could still feel the grime of the streets on them. I've been homeless for 8 months. I'm not exactly qualified for a director position. You led troops in combat, Trump countered. You made life or death decisions under pressure. I'd say you're overqualified. David turned his laptop again to show a social media feed. The photo of Trump and Linda had been shared millions more times overnight. Comments poured in from veterans sharing similar stories, from families of service members, from ordinary Americans expressing outrage at how veterans were treated. This isn't just about charity, Trump said, his voice growing passionate. It's about fixing a broken system. The foundation can act immediately, without red tape. We can help veterans while they wait for the government to get its act together. Linda studied the faces around her. She'd grown used to empty promises, to people who wanted to use her story for political points before moving on. But there was something different here. Concrete plans, real money, immediate action. This is moving very fast, she said finally. Joe nodded in understanding. Too fast, probably, but the spotlight won't last forever. We need to use this moment while people are paying attention. A news alert popped up on David's computer. He turned it to show a live broadcast from outside the hotel. Dozens of veterans had gathered, many holding signs with messages about VA reform and veteran homelessness. They're here because of you, Nancy said quietly. Because your story broke through. Linda stood and walked to the window. From this height, she could see the gathering crowd below. Someone had brought American flags. A woman held a sign reading, "My husband died waiting for VA care." Trump joined her at the window. You don't have to decide right now. Take the job, don't take the job. Either way, your disability benefits are coming through, and Joe has a place for you in his housing program. Linda turned to him, studying his face. Why didn't you do this when you were president? The question hung in the air, direct and challenging. The others in the room tensed, but Trump didn't seem offended. I tried, he said simply. Signed bills, increased funding. But the system resists change. Sometimes you can do more from the outside, pushing in. Linda looked back at the growing crowd below, then at the people waiting for her answer. Years of military training had taught her to recognize pivotal moments when they appeared. This was one of them. 6 months later, Linda stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Trump International Hotel. The room was packed with people, veterans in various stages of recovery, donors in expensive suits, and media cameras capturing every moment. She wore a simple navy blue blazer over a white shirt, her hair now neatly trimmed, but her posture remained military straight. When I first met Donald Trump, she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness at public speaking, I was sitting on a bench with nowhere to go. My country had forgotten me, just like it had forgotten thousands of other veterans. She paused, looking out at the crowd. In the front row sat several veterans who, just months ago, had been living on the streets. Now they were clean, housed, and receiving proper medical care. Some had even started jobs through the Foundation's employment program. I didn't trust him at first, Linda continued with a small smile. Thought it was all for show. Just another politician looking for a photo op. From the side of the stage, Trump chuckled, nodding in acknowledgement. But here's the thing about actions versus words, Linda said, growing more confident. Actions don't lie. In the past 6 months, the Veterans Second Chance Foundation has provided emergency housing for over 500 veterans across 15 states. We've helped expedite more than 1,200 stalled disability claims. Our medical partnership program has provided specialized care to veterans who couldn't get appointments through the VA. Behind her, a screen displayed photos of renovated apartment buildings now serving as transitional housing, medical clinics where veterans receive care, and various outreach events across the country. "I'm not standing here because I'm special," Linda said, her voice growing softer so the crowd leaned in to listen. "I'm standing here because I happen to be sitting on the right bench at the right time. But every veteran deserves the same chance I got." The crowd applauded as Linda gestured to Joe, who stood and took a small bow. His veterans housing program had been expanded to 3 new locations with funding from the foundation. "We're just getting started," Linda continued once the applause died down. "Today, I'm proud to announce that the foundation has secured commitments totaling over $50 million for the coming year." The crowd erupted again. The foundation had grown far beyond Trump's initial vision, with corporate partners, celebrity endorsements, and donations pouring in from across the political spectrum. "But money alone doesn't solve problems," Linda cautioned when the room quieted. "That's why we're launching our Veterans Advocate program, training former service members to help others navigate the system. Who better to guide you through the battlefield of bureaucracy than someone who's already fought that war?" As Linda continued outlining the new initiatives, a young woman slipped into the back of the ballroom. She wore a worn army jacket and clutched a backpack similar to the one Linda had carried 6 months earlier. One of the foundation's outreach workers noticed her and quietly approached, offering a friendly smile and a business card. After Linda finished her speech, Trump took the stage to thunderous applause. He waved it down, his expression more serious than his usual public persona. "When I met Linda," he began, "I wasn't planning to start a foundation. I wasn't thinking about policy reform or program initiatives. I just saw a veteran who needed help." He paused, looking around the room. "The easiest thing in the world is to walk past problems, to tell yourself someone else will handle it, that it's not your responsibility." He shook his head. "But sometimes the most important moments in life are when you stop walking and simply sit down next to someone who needs you." Later, as the event wound down, Linda found herself standing near the bench where it had all started. The city had installed a small plaque commemorating the meeting that sparked the foundation. It read simply, "Where listening led to action." A group of veterans approached her, men and women of different ages and backgrounds, but all bearing the invisible scars of service. "Is it true?" one of them asked. "Did you really go from homeless to running a multi-million-dollar foundation in 6 months?" Linda smiled. "I don't run it alone," she said, gesturing to the team of professionals who handled the daily operations. "I just make sure we never forget who we're really serving." A news crew came over, asking for one more interview. The reporter adjusted her microphone and asked the question Linda had heard countless times. "Did you ever imagine that sitting on that bench would lead to all this?" Linda glanced past the camera to where Trump was speaking with the young woman who had slipped in during her speech. The woman was crying, clutching paperwork that Linda recognized as foundation intake forms. Another veteran finding help. "No," Linda answered honestly. "But I've learned something important these past months. Change doesn't always come from grand plans or political promises. Sometimes it starts with one person stopping to really see another." The reporter nodded, satisfied with the soundbite, but Linda wasn't finished. "The real story isn't about me or even about Mr. Trump," she said, her voice firm. "It's about the thousands of veterans still out there, still waiting for someone to stop and see them. Our work is just beginning." As the sun set over the city, Linda watched as Trump personally walked the young female veteran to a waiting car that would take her to one of the foundation's housing facilities. 6 months ago, that had been her lost, forgotten, without hope. Now she stood tall, with purpose in her eyes and determination in her heart. The foundation wasn't perfect. The system wasn't fixed. But something had changed that day on the bench, not just for Linda, but for veterans across the country. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments: a bench, a conversation, a decision to stop walking past and start taking action.